For 20 years, scientists have described what's happening beneath Naples with a fairly reassuring word: unrest. Slow, cyclical, something the region has lived through before and settled back down from. That word just stopped being adequate. A new scientific analysis of Campi Flegrei, the vast volcanic caldera sitting directly beneath a metropolitan region of 3 million people, has concluded that the ground deformation and earthquake activity building underneath it is not following the gentle, wavering pattern researchers assumed for years. It is accelerating along a mathematical curve that physicists use to describe systems racing toward a breaking point, and the same modeling now points to a specific window, somewhere between 2030 and 2034, when the system could reach what researchers are calling a critical mechanical threshold. Independent geochemical evidence backs it up, showing that deep magmatic gas, not just shifting groundwater and steam, is now driving the pressure building beneath the caldera floor. This is not fringe speculation circulating on social media. This is peer-reviewed volcanological modeling, and it represents a meaningful shift in how scientists are talking about one of the most dangerous, most densely populated volcanic systems on the entire planet. Today, we're breaking down exactly what this new research found, why the mathematics behind it matters so much more than people realize, what a magmatic driver actually changes about the risk picture, and what all of this means for the roughly 1.5 million people who live inside and around this caldera without a mountain peak to remind them they're standing on top of a volcano at all. Before we get into the data, if stories like this matter to you, stories that track real, evolving scientific risk rather than recycled panic content, go ahead and subscribe now, because this is a developing situation and we will be tracking every update as new bulletins come in. And if you've ever lived somewhere with real geological risk hanging over daily life, an earthquake zone, a floodplain, a hurricane coast, drop a comment and tell us what that's actually like. Because understanding how people live with background risk is a huge part of understanding stories like this one. Now, let's get into what actually makes this new research different from everything that came before it. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand how scientists have been describing the shape of Campi Flegrei's unrest for the last 2 decades. Since 2005, the ground beneath Pozzuoli has been slowly rising in a process called bradyseism, the same phenomenon that shaped this coastline for thousands of years and that ancient Romans unknowingly documented on the marble columns of a seaside market now known as the Temple of Serapis. Those columns still show boreholes for marine mollusks up to 7 meters above their base, direct physical proof that this ground has sunk beneath the sea and risen back out of it multiple times over the last 2 millennia. So the phenomenon itself is not new, and it is not automatically catastrophic. What researchers have generally assumed, going back through the well-documented bradyseismic crises of 1969 to 1972 and 1982 to 1984, is that this kind of unrest behaves roughly exponentially. That means uplift and seismicity ramp up, but the rate of increase itself stays relatively proportional, a curve that bends upward steadily without necessarily racing towards some sudden climax. Exponential growth is scary sounding, but it is, in a strange way, the more comforting shape for a system like this to follow, because exponential curves can flatten, plateau, or reverse without anything dramatic happening at the peak. The new study changes that picture entirely. This is the actual headline of the entire story. A team of researchers analyzing the acceleration of both seismicity and ground deformation at Campi Flegrei found that the data does not fit an exponential curve nearly as well as it fits something called a regularized finite-time singularity. That phrase sounds intimidating, so let's break it down in plain terms, because it is genuinely the single most important concept in this entire update. A finite-time singularity is a mathematical description of a system where some measurable quantity theoretically races toward infinity at a specific, calculable point in time. In the real physical world, nothing actually reaches infinity. Materials break, pressure releases, or systems change state before that happens, which is why researchers use the regularized version of the model, one that captures the accelerating shape of the curve while acknowledging that reality intervenes before the mathematics blow up completely. This exact type of model has been used in other fields of science to describe systems approaching a critical transition. Moments where the underlying physical behavior of a system fundamentally changes, a material about to fracture, a fluid system about to flip from one flow pattern to another. When researchers say Campi Flegrei's data fits this pattern significantly better than a simple exponential curve, what they are really saying is that this is not a system gently trending upward. It is a system where the rate of acceleration is itself accelerating, curving ever more steeply towards some kind of transition point, rather than settling into a steady, predictable climb. That transition point is where the 2030 to 2034 window comes from. Independent analyses within the study converged on that range as the critical time, the point at which the current mathematical trajectory suggests the system reaches its threshold. And tied directly to that same projection is a genuinely striking number. Researchers project that total ground uplift at Campi Flegrei could reach approximately 4 meters by the early 2030s if the current trend continues uninterrupted. Sit with that figure for a second, because it's worth comparing to where things stand today. The ground near Pozzuoli has already risen more than 140 centimeters since 2005, a figure that itself sounds dramatic until you set it against a 4-meter projection just a handful of years down the road. That would mean the remaining rise from where the caldera sits right now to where this new model projects it heading could happen faster than the uplift accumulated over the entire previous 2 decades combined. That is precisely what an accelerating, non-exponential curve implies, and it's the mathematical signature behind everything we've been hearing about record-breaking earthquakes arriving closer and closer together over the last 2 years. Now, it is critically important to be precise about what a critical mechanical threshold actually means here, because this is exactly the point where casual reporting on this kind of research tends to spiral into misleading, sensationalized territory. Reaching a critical threshold does not automatically mean an eruption. What it means, in the language the researchers themselves use, is a regime change, a fundamental shift in how the crust above the magmatic and hydrothermal system behaves. That could mean new fracture networks opening up through previously intact rock. It could mean a jump in fumarole gas output at the surface. It could mean the system finding a new equilibrium that releases pressure gradually rather than catastrophically. An eruption is one possible outcome among several at a critical transition point like this, not the only one, and not necessarily even the most likely one based on current data. But here's why scientists are treating this new modeling so seriously despite that uncertainty. A system approaching a genuine critical transition is fundamentally less predictable and less stable than a system on a smooth, steady exponential trend. The whole reason mathematicians use finite time singularity models to describe systems approaching material failure or phase transitions is that these systems often show relatively little outward change right up until they don't, and then behavior can shift rapidly once the threshold is crossed. That unpredictability is the real story here, more than any specific doomsday prediction. Let's talk about the second major piece of this new picture, because it might be even more consequential than the mathematics of the acceleration curve itself, and that's the question of what is actually driving the pressure building beneath Campi Flegrei. For years, the dominant scientific framing of the unrest at this caldera treated it as primarily a hydrothermal phenomenon, meaning the pressure changes were largely attributed to groundwater and steam circulating through a shallow reservoir, heated and pressurized by heat rising from deeper in the earth, rather than by magma itself physically pushing closer to the surface. That distinction matters enormously in volcanology, because a hydrothermal system, while absolutely capable of producing damaging earthquakes and even small phreatic explosions, is a fundamentally different and generally less immediately hazardous scenario than one being actively driven by magma. This new research pulls in geochemical and statistical evidence indicating that deep magmatic volatile input, meaning gases sourced from actual molten or partially molten material deep in the crust, is progressively pressurizing the system from below. That is a meaningful evolution in the scientific narrative. It suggests the driver of this unrest is not simply a stable, cycling hydrothermal reservoir doing what it has done for centuries, but a magmatic system that is actively feeding gas and pressure into the crust above it in a progressively intensifying way. This lines up with earlier geochemical work that researchers have been building on for years. Prior studies analyzing the composition of gases venting from the Solfatara fumarole field, using ratios of nitrogen, helium, and carbon dioxide, identified evidence of a substantial pulse of magma degassing occurring deep within the plumbing system beneath the caldera, at pressures and depths consistent with roughly 8 kilometers underground. That earlier work estimated the volume of magma involved in that degassing pulse at around 3 cubic kilometers, a genuinely significant quantity of molten material, releasing volatile gases upward into the shallower hydrothermal system that then produces the uplift and seismicity we actually observe and measure at the surface. What the newest research adds is the temporal dimension, the mathematics showing that whatever is happening at depth is not just present. It is accelerating in a way that fits the signature of a system heading toward a genuine transition rather than oscillating in a stable long-term cycle. So let's connect this back to the actual earthquakes people have been feeling on the ground, because this is where the abstract mathematics becomes something you can directly observe happening in real time. Go back through the record and the pattern lines up disturbingly well with what this new model describes. In May of 2024, a magnitude 4 earthquake struck, at the time among the strongest events recorded in the area in roughly 40 years. In March of 2025, a compound earthquake event measuring 4. 6 struck, actually 2 nearly simultaneous ruptures layered on top of each other. In June of 2025, another 4. 6 hit. In May of 2026, a swarm beginning with a 4. 4-magnitude quake ran for 12 separate earthquakes before authorities declared it finished. And then on July 31st, 2026, a magnitude 4, 7 earthquake, the strongest in the region in 40 years by INGV's own assessment, struck at a depth of roughly 3 kilometers, injuring 21 people, collapsing unoccupied buildings, and triggering a swarm of more than 30 additional tremors through the night. Notice how the gaps between these strongest in decades headlines keep shrinking. That is not a coincidence, and it is not journalists exaggerating the story for clicks. That shrinking interval between escalating peak events is exactly the kind of signature that an accelerating, non-exponential system produces, and it is precisely the pattern this new research set out to formally characterize using rigorous statistical modeling rather than just narrative description. Ground deformation rates tell the same story from a different angle. Uplift beneath Pozzuoli has been measured at speeds ranging anywhere from roughly 10 millimeters a month during calmer stretches to as much as 30 millimeters a month during more active phases. An uplift centered in a radial pattern just southeast of an area called Rione Terra in Pozzuoli. Total accumulated uplift since 2005 now exceeds 1.5 meters in the most affected zones. Seismicity counts have followed a similarly steep trajectory. INGV recorded over 1,250 earthquakes in a single month back in April of 2024, the overwhelming majority too small to be felt without instruments. But in the week following this year's July 31st main shock, the tally reached 459 separate recorded quakes, some as large as magnitude 4. 5. When you lay both of those data sets, ground deformation and earthquake frequency, on the same timeline, they climb together and both climb in a way that increasingly resembles the accelerating curve this new research describes mathematically rather than the gentler exponential pattern scientists assumed for most of the last 2 decades. Let's talk honestly about what Italian authorities are actually doing in response to all of this, because the response has been substantial, and it long predates this latest study. The alert level for Campi Flegrei has sat at yellow, meaning attention, since 2012, 1 step above the baseline green level and 2 steps below the orange and red levels that would trigger active evacuation. Roughly 500,000 people live within the designated red zone. The 15 municipalities considered at highest risk should the unrest escalate toward an eruption scenario, and a further 840,000 live in the surrounding yellow zone, an area that would primarily face heavy ashfall rather than direct pyroclastic hazards in a worst-case scenario. Italy's Civil Protection Department updated its mass evacuation contingency plans in 2023 and 2024 specifically in response to the accumulating activity, and those plans call for evacuating the entire red zone population within 72 hours if the alert level is raised to what's called the alarm phase, corresponding to a high probability of imminent eruption. A 2022 economic study by Italy's National Research Council estimated that a full, immediate evacuation of the Campi Flegrei area under current emergency plans would cost approximately 30 billion euros annually and knock roughly 1% off Italy's gross domestic product. Numbers that underline just how enormous the stakes are, not only in terms of human safety, but in terms of the sheer logistical and economic weight of managing risk at this scale. Officials involved in planning have been candid that the biggest practical vulnerability isn't necessarily the science, it's the infrastructure. Escape routes in and around the caldera need widening. Older buildings, many constructed well before modern seismic codes existed, need structural assessment. And there's a psychological dimension too. Officials openly acknowledge that predicting how 500,000 people would actually behave during a rapid, chaotic evacuation order is its own enormous unknown, separate entirely from the geological question of when or whether an eruption might occur. Here's a resident's eye view of what living inside this slow-motion crisis actually looks like, because the human dimension of this story deserves attention alongside the science. People who have spent their whole lives in towns like Pozzuoli describe a population caught between generational familiarity and mounting apprehension. Some residents now keep an emergency bag packed by the door, ready to grab and go at a moment's notice, a habit that would have seemed excessive a decade ago and now feels almost standard practice for anyone paying attention to the escalating earthquake counts. This is the sharpest edge of what researchers call risk fatigue, a phenomenon where a population living through years of gradually intensifying but still manageable unrest can become simultaneously more anxious and more numb to any individual event, because there have simply been so many strongest in decades headlines that each new one risks blending into the last. That psychological reality is exactly why new, more precise scientific modeling like this actually matters for public communication. Not because it proves an eruption is coming, but because it gives researchers, and by extension journalists and the public, a sharper, evidence-based vocabulary for describing what's actually changing beneath their feet, instead of relying on vague reassurances or vague alarm. It's worth stepping back and putting Campi Flegrei in context against other volcanic systems that have gone through comparable episodes of accelerating unrest, because it helps calibrate expectations rather than treating this as some singular unprecedented case. Rabaul caldera in Papua New Guinea went through a dramatic multi-year unrest sequence through the 1980s and early 1990s that eventually culminated in eruption in 1994, giving volcanologists a real historical case study of what escalating caldera unrest looks like when it does eventually break toward an eruptive outcome rather than subsiding. Long Valley caldera in California, by contrast, has experienced recurring episodes of uplift and swarms of earthquakes across multiple decades without erupting at all, remaining in a persistent state of unrest that simply never crossed its own threshold. Yellowstone shows its own slow deformation cycles measured over years, again without any indication of magma actively approaching the surface in the current era. What all of these systems share is that unrest, even dramatic, headline-generating unrest, does not have a fixed, universal outcome. Some systems escalate toward eruption. Some settle into a new, quieter equilibrium. Some oscillate indefinitely. That range of real-world outcomes is exactly why this new finite-time singularity research is being treated as significant without being treated as a confirmed forecast. It sharpens the mathematical picture of where Campi Flegrei's trajectory currently points, without being able to definitively say which of those historical outcome categories this particular caldera will ultimately fall into. Let's dig a little deeper into the mechanics of how researchers actually built this model, because understanding the method helps explain why they're placing so much confidence in a projection that reaches years into the future. The team combined two independent datasets that have been collected continuously for the past 2 decades, high-precision ground deformation measurements gathered from continuous GPS stations and satellite radar interferometry, and a complete seismic catalog logging the timing, depth, and magnitude of every recorded earthquake in the caldera going back to the start of the current unrest phase in 2005. Rather than simply plotting those numbers on a chart and eyeballing the trend, the researchers applied rigorous statistical fitting techniques to test which mathematical model actually describes the acceleration best, comparing a standard exponential growth curve against the regularized finite-time singularity model directly, evaluating each against the same 20 years of real data. The finite-time singularity model won that comparison clearly, fitting both the deformation data and the seismicity data with meaningfully lower error than the exponential alternative. And critically, the researchers didn't rely on a single method to estimate when that critical time might arrive. Multiple independent analytical approaches, applied separately to the deformation data and to the seismicity data, converged on essentially the same window, the early 2030s. When independent lines of evidence built from different underlying datasets arrive at a similar answer, that convergence is exactly what gives scientists confidence that they're capturing something real about the underlying physical process, rather than an artifact of how one particular dataset happened to be measured or processed. It's also worth understanding a little more about what a finite-time singularity actually looks like in other physical systems, because this style of model didn't originate in volcanology. Researchers first developed and refined these mathematical tools studying material failure, tracking the acoustic emissions a piece of rock or metal gives off as microscopic cracks accumulate in the moments before it fractures under stress. As a material approaches its breaking point, the frequency of these tiny crack formation events doesn't just increase, it increases at an increasing rate, tracing exactly the kind of accelerating curve that characterizes a finite-time singularity. The same mathematical family has since been applied to a surprisingly wide range of systems approaching a critical transition. Everything from the dynamics of certain financial market crashes to the failure of engineered structures under mounting load. What all of these applications share is the same underlying physical intuition, a system holding a large amount of accumulated stress or energy, releasing small amounts of that stress in discrete events, seismic in the volcanic case, until the frequency and intensity of those discrete releases accelerates past a point where the system structure can no longer accommodate incremental release, and something more fundamental gives way. Applying that framework to Campi Flegrei doesn't prove an eruption is coming any more than a fracturing rock sample proves the exact moment it will snap. But it does mean the underlying stress state of the crust above the magmatic hydrothermal system is behaving in a way mathematically consistent with a structure approaching some kind of mechanical limit, which is precisely the language the researchers use when they describe the projected 2030 to 2034 window as a critical time rather than an eruption date. There's an important nuance buried in that distinction between critical time and eruption date that's worth spending a moment on, because it's the single easiest part of the story to misrepresent. A critical mechanical threshold, in the specific technical sense researchers are using it, describes the point at which the current pattern of gradual incremental stress release, Small earthquakes, modest uplift pulses, becomes mechanically unsustainable, forcing some kind of structural change in how the crust behaves. Multiple outcomes are consistent with reaching that threshold. The crust could develop a new network of fractures that opens up additional pathways for gas and fluid to vent more efficiently, effectively relieving pressure through an expanded plumbing system without magma ever reaching the surface, something researchers have specifically flagged as one plausible resolution. Alternatively, the system could transition into a new, higher baseline level of unrest, essentially settling into a more active but still non-eruptive steady state for years or decades afterward. Or, in the scenario people understandably fixate on, the accumulated pressure could eventually breach the crust in a genuine eruptive event. The mathematics behind this new model describes the shape of the road leading up to that fork. It doesn't tell you which branch the system ultimately takes once it gets there, and the researchers themselves have been careful to frame their findings that way, rather than overstating the certainty of any single outcome. Let's also talk about what this means practically for the scientists and emergency planners actually responsible for this region, because a projection like this changes the operational calculus even without predicting a specific outcome. Emergency planning at Campi Flegrei has historically been built around a reactive escalation model, monitoring day-to-day seismicity and deformation, and adjusting the alert level and evacuation readiness incrementally as thresholds are crossed in something closer to real time. A projection that identifies a specific multi-year window as mechanically significant gives planners something they haven't really had before: a forward-looking target date range to actually plan infrastructure, investment, and public education campaigns around, rather than simply reacting to each individual swarm as it happens. Widening evacuation routes, reinforcing older buildings, and running public evacuation drills all take years to properly execute, and knowing that the early 2030s represent a mathematically significant window for potential regime change gives officials a genuine planning horizon to work against, whether or not the caldera ultimately erupts within it. Researchers involved in Campi Flegrei's multi-risk communication efforts have specifically emphasized that this kind of quantitative, time-bound framing, even with its uncertainty, is more useful for long-term planning than the more open-ended, the system remains in unrest language that has dominated public communication for most of the last 2 decades. Let's also be clear about what the current data explicitly does not show, because responsible coverage of a story like this requires holding both the concerning new findings and the reassuring absence of certain signals in the same frame. Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology has been consistent in stating that current monitoring does not show evidence of an imminent eruption, let alone one of any large magnitude. None of the roughly 70 eruptions that have occurred at Campi Flegrei over the last 15,000 years, since the caldera's last truly catastrophic collapse events, come anywhere close to the doomsday scenarios that circulate in some corners of the internet whenever this caldera makes headlines. The 1538 eruption, the most recent one, was locally significant. It built an entirely new hill and displaced nearby communities for a period, but it was a far cry from the ancient Campanian ignimbrite and Neapolitan yellowtuff eruptions that carved out the caldera itself tens of thousands of years ago, and which are genuinely comparable in scale to history's largest volcanic events. The dense, multi-parameter monitoring network watching Campi Flegrei right now, seismometers, continuous GPS stations, satellite radar interferometry, and gas sampling equipment at the Solfatara and Picciarelli fumarole fields, has not detected the kind of sudden shift in gas geochemistry or very long period seismic activity that would specifically indicate magma making a rapid, direct approach toward the surface. That absence of a specific eruption precursor signature is precisely why officials continue describing the alert level as yellow rather than escalating it, even in the wake of this new accelerating unrest research and even after a 40-year record earthquake. So where does that actually leave the honest bottom line here? What's genuinely new and consequential about this research is not a prediction that Campi Flegrei will erupt. It's a mathematical refinement of how scientists understand the shape of the trend the caldera has been on since 2005, revealing that the acceleration researchers have been documenting for years fits a pattern associated with systems approaching a genuine critical transition far better than it fits the gentler exponential curve that shaped expectations for most of the last 2 decades. Combined with geochemical evidence pointing toward an increasingly active magmatic gas source rather than a purely hydrothermal one, this represents a real shift in the scientific understanding of what's driving the activity beneath one of Europe's most densely populated volcanic regions. That shift matters enormously for long-term monitoring priorities, for how emergency planners think about the multi-year window ahead, rather than just reacting earthquake by earthquake, and for how honestly the public conversation around this caldera gets framed going forward. It does not, on its own, mean the 4-meter uplift projection will actually be reached. Systems approaching a modeled critical transition can, and often do, find new equilibriums, release pressure through smaller events, or shift into different behavior entirely before ever reaching a full eruptive outcome. But it does mean the 2030 to 2034 window researchers have identified deserves to be treated as a genuine focal point for monitoring investment and public preparedness planning. Over the years immediately ahead, not dismissed as an abstract academic curiosity buried in a journal article. What happens between now and then depends entirely on what the ongoing monitoring data continues to show. INGV will keep publishing regular bulletins, tracking uplift rates, earthquake counts and depths, and fumarole gas geochemistry, and those bulletins, not any single dramatic headline, are the actual signal worth following if you want to understand where this story is genuinely heading. If uplift rates climb sharply beyond the ranges recorded so far, if swarms begin producing repeated events above magnitude 5, or if gas geochemistry at Solfatara and Pisciarelli shifts in ways consistent with magma moving meaningfully closer to the surface, rather than simply feeding pressure into the shallow hydrothermal system from depth, that is the moment this conversation would need to shift again, from accelerating unrest towards something requiring a genuinely different level of public alert. Until, and unless that happens, what we are watching is a rigorously monitored, scientifically well-characterized volcanic system whose underlying mathematics just got a great deal more precise and considerably more urgent than they were even a year ago. One more thread worth pulling on before we wrap this up is how this new modeling interacts with the actual lived texture of the seismic swarms people in the region have been experiencing. Swarms at Campi Flegrei rarely arrive as a single clean shock. They tend to build in bursts, dozens of small to moderate events clustering within hours, easing off, and then flaring again days or weeks later, a rhythm that researchers studying the caldera's burst-like seismicity between 2021 and 2024 specifically documented as becoming increasingly frequent and increasingly compressed in time. That burst-like character is itself a piece of supporting evidence for the finite time singularity framing, because a system smoothly trending exponentially upward would generally be expected to produce a more gradually thickening rhythm of events, while a system approaching a genuine mechanical threshold tends to produce exactly this kind of episodic, clustering behavior, periods of relative quiet punctuated by increasingly energetic bursts. Residents living through this pattern describe a very particular kind of psychological toll that's different from living with a single major earthquake risk. The sense that the ground could give you weeks of relative calm and then, without much additional warning, another night like July 31st. That unpredictability of timing, even within a scientifically well-characterized long-term trend, is precisely why officials continue to stress that individual preparedness, knowing evacuation routes, keeping emergency supplies ready, staying attentive to official civil protection guidance rather than social media speculation, remains just as important during this newly characterized accelerating phase as it was during the 2 decades of slower buildup that preceded it. This is exactly the kind of story worth staying close to as it develops, because the value here isn't in reacting to one dramatic number. It's in understanding the trend underneath it well enough to actually make sense of whatever comes next. So subscribe if you want to keep tracking this alongside us, because between this new acceleration modeling, the 2030 to 2034 window, and the ongoing swarm activity across the caldera, there is going to be a lot more here worth understanding in the months and years ahead. And before you go, let us know in the comments, given everything in this new research, do you think Campi Flegrei is heading toward an actual eruption within this decade? Or do you think this ends the way the previous crises in the 1970s and 1980s did, with the system finding a new equilibrium and easing back down? We would genuinely love to hear your take. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually changed in the science here instead of just reacting to a scary headline, share it with someone who would find it useful, and we will see you in the next one.